Hello and welcome to this video on the population of the Matrix. The original Matrix is a cultural landmark. It begins with Neo being one of many in the Matrix. He is living in an artificial world created to host the human consciousness. Every living human's body is held in a pod. This pod sustains their life, and every other human is fundamentally in the same position unless they've been red-pilled. Billions of these pods are connected to cylindrical towers that form what are described as power plants. There are also much smaller versions that are up to 5 feet tall and hold 5 or 6 fetuses. We'll discuss these later. The question is, how realistic are the depictions of this, and if it is feasible, how so? First, we have the sustaining humans. That is, humans already in the pods. All humans have 5 basic requirements: air, food, water, shelter, and sleep that apply in this context. The pod must be able to provide all of these literally and as a consequence of the environment. First, we have air, and this might seem too obvious. The problem is that every pod is filled with liquid. This means intubation is the only practical way for this to happen. This will allow air to be delivered to every occupant, and it also minimizes the energy demands of the occupant. It will standardize respiration rate and gas exchange. This is done by replacing the anatomical or muscle movements with mechanical ventilation, and this will allow air to move into the body and out again. By moving air at a set rate, a whole area can be ventilated at the same time with a simple single air pump. The use of ventilation also reduces skeletal and smooth muscle activity. This means you do not need to worry about muscle exhaustion. This would reduce respiration rate, increase metabolic activity, and acidify the blood. It is a phenomenon that occurs with intubation due to the smaller volume of air that can be moved through the tube. Fundamentally, the less the occupant needs to do, the fewer problems will occur for the Matrix as a system that controls them. One of the important problems likely to occur if something like a liquid media saturated with oxygen was to be used is that any pathogen or microorganism that gets in will proliferate and attack the occupant from the outside in. Intubation avoids this and means the whole body's defenses, particularly in the respiratory pathway, can prevent anything that does not get caught in filters or similar from the mechanical ventilation system. This is really important for something on the scale of the Matrix human farm. It must be simple, low power, and reliable. The more complex, energy demanding, minimal amount of replacement parts or units, and a simplicity of function means that there is more demand on the limited resources available. This means one big filter system can accommodate many individual plants. Further to that, it has important implications for later on. Getting air, and importantly oxygen, into the occupant is one thing, but it's removing and recycling CO2 that is another, if not more significant issue. The planet lacks much of any kind of organism that would normally convert CO2 into O2. The only practical option is something like algae. Algae is very efficient, far more so than trees, at converting CO2 into O2, as long as you give them some degree of light, water, and CO2. Algae will do 3 important things in this context. The first is that it thrives in heat, and any heat generated in the pod can be carried away to a location where the algae is to act as a sort of heat pump. This will promote its growth, but we'll come back to the heat issue later. The second is it converts CO2 into O2. This is necessary for humans, and without a recycling system, there would not be enough oxygen and far too much CO2, eventually leading to the death of all of the beings in the pods. This is needed for humans to ensure they do not die, which is an obvious statement. But more importantly for this, without oxygen, there is no brain activity or most other functions the human body needs to rely on. The human body can only rely on protein and lipids for so long before it runs out of these resources or begins to deteriorate due to other products made. Finally, there is the practicality of turning algae into food. Algae are very rich in proteins. They're also found in both fresh and seawater, so the exact source of water used isn't really important. You'll find that they contain a number of amino acids, a lot of fatty acids, They have things like omega-3, omega-6, omega-7, along with vitamins A, D, and E. To an extent, this solves the problem of providing food and energy, but it also must be delivered via feeding tubes. This creates a secondary problem of what happens at the end of the GI tract. It is necessary for the algae to be provided in liquid form, largely so it is to be transportable in tubes and pipes. This would need to be a very dry fluid. The combination of what is a very dry soup would also provide all the water needed for the occupant, along with nutrition. This is necessary, as not all blood going to the kidneys has the water recovered from the kidneys. In fact, only part of it is. The body can be stimulated to try and recover more, but there is always a certain amount lost regardless. This is removed as urine. The amount removed as urine must be replaced, and this is done by water in the food products that are consumed. Therefore, you need to remove this fluid, and this must be done with a similar system of invasive tubing. Anything less would lead to the pod becoming contaminated with feces and, well, urine. Nominally, this would be deadly if there is bacteria or other microorganisms in the feces. In this case, you need exposure to bacteria for this to happen. In a perfect scenario, the bacteria would not be present, but for a problem with the human GI tract, it's not perfect. In fact, to a degree, microbes need to be present. They are what help to prevent allergies, autoimmune diseases, and, to a certain extent, absorption of nutrients and vitamins. It is a somewhat symbiotic relationship. This is why, even if ideally a micro-free GI tract was possible, it wouldn't be functionally possible. Of course, these tubes also serve a secondary purpose. The much larger tubes serve a secondary purpose. That is to facilitate the movement of the most common and pervasive source of nutrition, Soylent Green, or at least its precursor. As it's described, liquefied biological matter is intravenously force-fed back to any of the living humans. That is, humans are fed to other humans, and this creates issues around prion diseases. Anyone who's looked into cannibalistic practices would know that in very short order, they tend to develop, cognitive and psychiatric issues. That is a result of prion diseases from eating proteins contaminated with it, primarily from other individuals contaminated by prion diseases. We have a whole video on how this could be made theoretically possible using the Soylent Green example. Shelter is the next issue. Not the typical shelter from water, wind, and cold, but the environment of the matrix. Each human is suspended in a pod full of fluid. This capsule is in a much larger array of individuals, the power plant. The environment is going to fluctuate considerably. You're either going to have extreme heat or extreme cold based on the location of the pod and the ability to move heat. We already stated that each human pod generates heat, and this heat will build up over time and have to radiate away. If this is in a large environment, the pods in the highest position in the closed environment, even if it is large, will get the most heat, whilst those at the very bottom will be the coldest. These two extremes are something that are a problem. Secondary to that is that as long as the humans continue to live and metabolize, they will produce heat from their body. This means that you need to find a way to remove it, but also keep just enough that they are, let's say, stable. This is the first kind of shelter required. It's protection from the loss of heat to convection, or the accrual of too much heat from convection to start with. This needs to be balanced or removed in the case of too much heat. This can be done, as we've mentioned, by, for example, moving the heat along some sort of conductive fluid, much like, say, an air conditioner or a heat pump, to large algae ponds that would then use that to, increase the population of the algae, which can then be used both to make O2 and food. Why the pod is filled with fluid? And notably, if the occupants were not suspended in fluid, they would experience what those in hospital beds for a long time experience, bed sores or pressure sores. These are from the mattress or bed pushing on the skin and reducing blood flow. This deprives the skin or tissue of nutrients and oxygen. The skin then begins to become damaged and eventually necrotize. Being suspended in fluid removes the issue of pressure in most common places. This, at least in theory, means no bed sores. However, areas around the face mask and similar areas where you have, let's say, invasive devices are a concern. These would, in theory, also cause bed sores. Depending on how and what happens, this would need to be mitigated through some sort of, let's say, adaptive process, whether that is a far more permanent affixing to the human body or not. Next, we have concerns about the pod itself and that it needs to provide enough UV light to activate vitamin D, but it's not so much that it causes DNA damage. This needs to be carefully balanced, as vitamin D is something necessary for the human body to function to some extent. Not enough has effects on the heart, cognitive function and more, but too much and you would have UV light causing cancer. The challenge in these pods is sleep. And to some extent, humans rely on light to modulate our circadian rhythm, and without light we get thrown into chaos. This is another reason why having UV light is important. To some extent, a combination of light on a timer would solve this issue. The direct neural connection might also be used for similar purposes as described later. We then have sleep, and this directly relates to the circadian rhythm. Sleep and most active minds are not exactly compatible. You really have 4 states of consciousness for this video: actively awake, REM sleep, light sleep, and deep sleep. During REM sleep and being awake, your brain is the most active. During the other 2 periods, the brain is far less active. The problem is that the consciousness is both a controllable condition but also one which you gradually lose control of in this situation. That is, as you get more tired, you have less ability to prevent yourself from sleeping, and it adds an unpredictable element to the pod's occupant. That means you need to accommodate 4 different states of being conscious, let's say, and the 4 different brain activities associated with that, 2 of which are going to have constant output to the system, 1 of which will have constant output to the system and need input back in, and 2 of which are, for lack of a better description, a net drain on the system. That is because when you are in light sleep and deep sleep, you're not going to be putting out as much energy as you would be needing to put into the brain. The pod must be able to accommodate this varying state of consciousness, and this will rely heavily on the interface between body and machine. This leads us inevitably into the next issue of how the pod can allow the inhabitant to connect and interact with the matrix. In the pod, the occupants use a large number of connection points. Once outside of the matrix, it seems like only a single connection to the brainstem and occipital lobe is used, this being the brain spike, or brain connection. The connections are what connect the human and pod, or as it is called, the power plant. These are the main purposes. You sustain the occupant, and you provide power to the system, that is, the matrix. There is some evidence from the series to show that there's also nuclear energy available. However, for the purposes of this video, we'll focus solely on what the pod does. The connections that are available must work 2 ways. That is, they must draw power and transmit signals, while simultaneously providing feedback or signals to the pod occupant and possibly also needing to provide power. It is similar to a certain extent to power over Ethernet. That is a data and electricity connection, but it only suits lower power systems. For the purposes of this video, let's assume an equivalent to Ethernet. Ethernet cables can each provide up to 44 volts of direct current per connection. Each neuron in your body can generate approximately 70 millivolts during each action potential. That assumes that once it gets to the spine, it's then intercepted and all the power from that should have propagated the action potential further on is drawn into the matrix instead. This would also prevent the body from being, let's say, active and moving at all times. And by doing so, it means that you can simulate the effects of sleep by preventing the body from being active while still letting the individual remain conscious. With that in mind, it means that each neuron firing has roughly the equivalent of 0.07 volts. Based on just the intercostal or rib nerves, these are able to produce about 1.7 volts. This assumes no loss during transmission, and that all of the connections you see on the rib cage are connecting to just one of these. There is further energy available from the spinal cord, which would be the central connection or that which goes directly into the brain. Since we now have at least 36 nerves originating from the spinal cord that could be tapped at this point, you can get more or less the equivalent of 2.56 volts. This is per a single activation or action potential per nerve. Nerves are made up of neurons, and neurons have between less than 1 and more than 200 activations or action potentials per second. Each has its own range based on the role that it is, for example sensorial motor neurons, innervation, and having the necessary extra and intracellular contents. This means at the low end we have less than 2.56 volts a second, and at the high end we have 512 volts per second per person per pod, the latter being far higher than the capacity of any Ethernet cable, but that is a somewhat arbitrary cutoff. It does, however, accommodate the distributed bioprocessing of the matrix universe alongside this transmission of power. That is, each human brain acts like a chiplet, modern CPU setups. The chiplets work together, and this allows them to process much larger tasks by distributing smaller elements to each appropriate individual. That is power leaving the body, and to a certain extent processing leaving the body. There is the issue of input and output if we're going to treat each individual in the power plant as a chiplet, but also as a way of generating power. How do you send signals to the occupant, or more importantly, receive information from them? The collection of energy theoretically can also be reversed. This is not only how you can collect energy, or at least measure it, to know if a signal should be there, but you should be able to stimulate a reaction. This is similar to how modern technology uses the sensed activities of neurons and interprets it. Rather than interpreting it in this case, it is, in some instances, harvesting it, and in other cases, analyzing it. This lets the machine use the data generated to, generate an image. In theory, doing the reverse should allow the machine to infer an image, that is, imprint an image on the brain based on the appropriate stimulation of parts of the brain. A very primitive version of this is used to allow people to walk again by sending a motor signal. That's telling the body what to do, or at least by stimulating that part of the brain, you allow the body to think it's moving. A slightly more advanced version of this is a way of recreating eyesight. This directly interfaces with the occipital lobe for vision. It creates a very rough and simple replacement that is functionally effective. Doing this, you have a viable method of creating the world experience in the Matrix. It also explains how the Matrix can use the humans themselves to generate power, and why it doesn't require huge, for example, server banks, to be able to develop the world, as each individual, particularly since large parts of their brain are not being used for, the intended purpose, could theoretically be retrofitted or repurposed through the brain's elasticity to, let's say, create the world and a biocomputer from it, or for it. All of this is fine for a single generation, but then the question is, what about beyond that? How do you keep the Matrix going? This is where the uncomfortably named fetus fields are used. We mentioned early on that there are towers that are able to accommodate 6 to 8 fetuses, and they're like a small tree or cornstalk, where the fetuses are growing from it. The fetus fields and the technology used in them are a problem, not because of the ethics or morals, since an AI or robotic overlord has neither, or rather, the issue is the human development process. As strange as it may sound, it would make far more sense to have a body that is underdeveloped due to a lack of growth hormone, but a fully developed brain. The reason for this is that by having a underdeveloped physique outside of the brain, you minimize the amount of sustenance required, while not drastically affecting the necessary energy generated from the brain and spinal cord. This maximizes the power output whilst minimizing the energy demands of the individual. Since we only see fully grown adults, this must not be what happens for plot reasons. Since we can Ignore the kakakadori of full-grown humans, the problem lies in how you go from a fetus to a full human. That is, an adult human is grossly different to a developing infant, or a fetus for that matter. A pod human has never used their body in any significant manner, and this means their muscles are very atrophied and weak. This is something we observe, or would expect to see in this situation. The problem is not that they've never used their muscles, but their body has grown anyway. The infants need to have a brain jack and other implants inserted into them, and the implants are not just one or two, there are many. As the infant grows larger, new implants would need to be inserted or used to replace the existing implants, like the brain jack for instance. This is because they get bigger over time. Yet despite this, we see nothing about implants being replaced or adjusted. This is especially important as the infant's brain grows to about 4 times what its size at birth is by the time they reach adulthood. This means any implant given as an infant would not be suitable as an adult. Bone growth and changes, neural connections, and more. The important thing there is especially the connections in the brain. The brain makes more connections as the infant grows into a child, then an adolescent, and then as a human. Even as an adolescent, the brain grows and makes connections, and many of these are driven at least in part by hormones. If these new connections are not accommodated, then the implant will not work as well, if at all. This is why most implants are used later in life after permanent changes have happened. Imagine if you had someone connected to the Matrix, but they had no real way to, let's say, translate the idea of puberty. The brain simply isn't processing that the individual has changed. They would forever and always be a child in the Matrix. To some extent, we could see that use of wireless implants could mitigate some of the damage or issues we've observed, but as we also noted, it's called a brain jack, and that's because individuals are literally connected via a jack to the Matrix. Therefore, wireless implants seem very unlikely. In order for the Matrix to not only interact with the human pod, but for the occupant to use it as an interactive environment from birth or close enough to, it needs to have this development and change over time. You also have the issue that it would need to begin from birth or close enough to in order to analyze and build a brain signal model for each individual. This is what allows it to understand what the occupant wants to do and how to stimulate the occupant's brain to understand how to tell it that this is what has happened. Think of it this way. Right now, in order for a neurosurgeon to be able to understand not only if the patient, let's say, is responding as intended to surgery, it is entirely reasonable to expect that they would be awake, active, and asked to respond to certain questions, stimuli, or actions. This tells the surgeon whether or not they are tinkering with the right part of the brain, and this is real-time action, where they get immediate response, not having to learn how the brain works in its entirety and how to interact and engage and then necessarily stimulate the entirety of the brain. The system would take a very long time, and any advanced algorithm or AI would have to be able to do this in order for the Matrix to work as it is depicted to us. This leaves us with a number of problems, largely because we know that individuals have come out of the Matrix and they are largely functional adults. This means that the Matrix is not, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, tinkering with the brains and personalities of individuals to make them, let's say, more convenient to the system. It is entirely human-centric. That means human behaviors must be modeled and acted on accordingly. If this were ignored, then it makes sense that an AI or algorithm would choose to make it as simple and basic as humanly possible. That is, for lack of a better way of putting this, put them in a white box and have them give no stimulation whatsoever. That would ensure that whatever is happening gets no reaction from the individual, but they would also be driven mad. Overall, we can see how you could theoretically get a large proportion of the power needed for all of the described systems. The question of creating new humans is a little more questionable without more details, but those aren't really available. The life pods, or power plants, are entirely feasible, but they also raise more issues that aren't really explained very well in either the movies or extra universal material. In simple terms, the biggest issue is going to be the interface between humans and the Matrix. But even then, there are feasible pathways based on modern technology from about 20 years later where we are getting to that point. Even now, the neural link by Elon Musk is looking like it might be getting initial approvals where you can have a human brain interacting with the world. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below